Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we take a whole lot of information and really boil it down to the good stuff, the fascinating bits, the surprising connections, all for you. Today, we're doing something pretty special. We're diving deep into the Holzbach family history. It's this incredibly detailed history put together by Dr. R. Thomas Holzbach.
And it's not just, a list of names and dates. It's so much more. He used church records, history books, family stories, even old obituaries.
Right, and our goal here is to trace this one family's amazing path. From a tiny village in Germany all the way to America, we want to uncover the history happening around them, the personal struggles, everything that shaped their lives.
Yeah, it's going to be quite the journey piecing this puzzle together.
So let's get started.
What's really interesting, I think, is how this specific family story, the Holzbachs, kind of opens a window onto bigger things, the universal stuff, migration challenges, huge changes in society over centuries, and just the sheer effort it takes to even keep a family history alive.
Absolutely. And we're talking records going back to the late 1600s.
Late 1600s, yeah. Nearly 1,700 names involved. Just imagine the individual lives behind all that.
That scale is just, wow. It's hard to get your head around. So where does this massive story actually begin?
It starts small, in this tiny hilltop village, almost lost to time, called Schrukow. It's in Germany, in the Rhineland-Palatinate area, just a bit east of Meisenheim. And that's where we first find an ancestor documented in church records, a Johannes Holzbach, around 1698.
True. And it was so tiny it didn't even have its own church, right? I read that the original houses from when the Holzbachs left are gone now. Just a late 19th century farmhouse stands there today.
That's right. But the area itself on the Rhine's west bank, it's famous for its vineyards,
Yeah.
along the Nahe and Glan rivers. Wine country.
Gotcha. Wine country.
Yeah, grapes were important, definitely. But the politics and religion of the place, incredibly complex, and that directly impacted families like the Holzbachs. By the time they left, mid-1800s, their little part of the Rhineland was actually controlled by Bavaria.
Bavaria. But that's miles away.
Exactly. Over 100 miles from what we think of as Bavaria.
Yeah.
But the local people genuinely saw themselves as Bavarians. Well, it's kind of strange, right?
That is strange. It really makes you wonder how they thought about home. Must have been quite fluid.
Totally. And just north of the Nahe River, places like Sobernheim, that was Prussian territory, mostly Lutheran. So you could literally have relatives across the river who considered themselves citizens of a different country, different official religion.
Wow.
And marriages across those lines happened all the time. So their loyalties, their identities were constantly being navigated. It was complex.
Sounds like a genealogist's headache, trying to untangle all that.
Yeah.
And you mentioned complexity. The source brings up the 30 Years' War. That ended way back in 1648, long before the first Holzbach we know of. Why is that relevant?
Good question. Because even though it seems distant, its effects lingered. People often see it as just Catholic versus Protestant, right?
Yeah, mostly.
But it was really about power and territory. France, for example, a Catholic country, was secretly bankrolling the Lutheran Swedish army just to counter the Habsburgs. The main outcome was a Germany that was deeply fractured, split into powerful states like Prussia and Bavaria.
Okay.
So that political reality is what created those religious and regional divides we were just talking about in the Holzbach's backyard. The war didn't just redraw maps. It left this legacy of shifting borders and tangled identities that directly affected families like theirs centuries later.
Huh. So their decision to leave in the 1800s is almost like an echo of that 17th century chaos.
You could almost see it that way, yeah, a ripple effect.
That's a really surprising connection. So how did Dr. Holzbach even start digging through all these layers to find the family's roots?
Well, it was a massive job, and honestly, he got pretty lucky. He managed to connect with Gunther F. Anthes. He was the honorary archive keeper from Eisenheim, and this connection was gold. Anthes helped confirm and add to Dr. Holzbach's findings, especially using microfilm records from the Latter-day Saints Center in Salt Lake City.
The LDS records, they have so much.
They do. But even with that help, finding anything before 1680, basically impossible. The records just aren't there. And even between 1680 and 1700, things are very, very sketchy.
The classic genealogical brick wall where the trail just goes cold. But they did manage to trace the line back to a Johannes and Anna Maria, born somewhere between 1680 and 1700 in Schrukow. So what do we know about those first few generations in Germany before the big move?
Well, the early generations, they seem to have had pretty large families, and they were really embedded in that little community. Johannes and Anna Maria, they had 9 kids, all born right there in Schrukow.
No.
Yeah. And their son, Johann Hendrik, he carried on the line. married Maria Eva Moog, also from the village, and their son, another Johannes born in 1764, he actually became an administrator of Schreckhof. So you can see the family gaining a bit of standing locally.
Okay, so becoming more established. And it's through this Johannes's sixth child, Johann Jakob, born 1795, that we get to the main branch we're following today, right?
That's the one, Johann Jakob. He married twice,
Uh-huh.
and it's his second wife, Katharina Sibylla, who's the mother of the 12 children who eventually came to America.
12 kids. And they are the ones who made the leap.
Exactly. This fifth generation in Germany, those 12 children of Johann Jakob and Katharina Sibylla, they're the heart of the immigrant story for this family. Their ages were all over the place, too. Jacob, the oldest of this group, born 1834, down to William, born 1855.
So they didn't all come over at once.
No, definitely staggered. The youngest ones actually came over with their parents, Johann Jakob and Katharina Sibylla, landing in Massillon, Ohio in the summer of 1865.
Right. And Germany in the mid-1800s, the source makes it sound pretty grim. An economic and cultural backwater compared to places like Britain or France.
Yeah, that's a fair description from the source.
Yeah.
The Industrial Revolution was only just starting to gain traction there, maybe around the 1860s.
Plus severe overpopulation and the same potato blight that hit Ireland so hard.
Exactly. It created this immense pressure cooker. Life was still mostly farming, agrarian, and when you combine exploding populations with failing crops, well, survival itself became precarious.
So leaving wasn't just about finding a better opportunity, it was almost necessary.
For many, yes,
Mhm.
it really became a matter of survival, forcing families like the Holzbach to leave everything they'd ever known behind. A huge, huge decision.
And arriving in America, it wasn't like they rolled out the welcome mat, was it? Jacob Holzbach, the first of this main line, he arrived in 1849. He was only 15.
15, yeah. And he landed in chaos. Total chaos. See, in 1849, there wasn't one single place like Ellis Island yet. Ships just dumped passengers anywhere along miles of waterfront in New York.
Leaving them totally exposed.
Completely vulnerable to scammers, thieves, you name it. These boarding house runners were infamous. They'd trick immigrants into these overpriced, awful places to stay. It was a really grim situation. A dark side to that arrival story we don't always hear about.
Just awful. So if it was such a mess, did things improve? Did they set up anything to protect people?
They did eventually, Castle Garden. That opened in the mid-1850s, and it was a big step up.
Castle Garden, okay.
It was a designated landing spot, offered some protection, still had problems, dealing with fraud and just the sheer number of people, many not speaking English. But it was better. Most of the Holzbach family, the ones arriving between the late 50s and 1865, they would come through Castle Garden.
Right. It's easy to forget Ellis Island didn't open until 1892, long after the Holzbachs got here.
Exactly. Different era of immigration processing.
So from New York, they didn't stick around. They made a beeline for Massillon, Ohio. Why Massillon? What was the pull?
Connections, mainly. They knew relatives who were already there. They had been writing back and forth. This chain migration, it wasn't just, a handy way to pick a spot. It was everything. It was your social safety net, your job finder, your emotional support.
A whole package.
Absolutely. Especially when you're in a completely new country, those family and community networks were vital for survival.
And the journey itself changed, too.
Yeah, for Jacob back in 49, it would have been a long slog. Probably canals, lake boats. Took a while. But after 1852, you could get a train to Massillon, which made it much, much faster for the later arrivals.
And Massillon itself was changing around that time, wasn't it? Moving away from wheat farming towards brokering.
Mining, yeah, and stone quarrying, too. The economy was shifting. And that shift basically explains what the first generation of Holzbach immigrants ended up doing for work.
Makes sense. They needed jobs.
And the local industries needed workers. So many of them got pulled into mining or related trades. Andrew Holzbach, for example, he was a miller back in Germany. Here, he became a coal miner, even co-owned a mine eventually in Stark County.
Wow, quite a transition. Miller to mine owner.
Shows how the local economy really shaped their new lives and opportunities.
Okay, that leads us nicely into becoming citizens. Naturalization. That term comes all the way from the Declaration of Independence, apparently? What did it actually involve for these immigrants?
It was this interesting two-step process. Seems designed to integrate people, but also make them prove they were serious about staying. First step was the Declaration of Intention, sometimes called First Papers. You usually had to live locally for a year, get witnesses to swear for you.
Okay, declare your intent. Then what?
Then, typically 5 years later, you could apply for the final naturalization, your second papers. Though right after the Civil War, sometimes judges could speed that up a bit.
Then where did this happen? Not like a federal office today.
mostly in county probate courts, like the one in Canton for Stark County, sometimes even in these migratory courts of common pleas that traveled around.
Migratory courts. Huh. In finding these papers today, it can be hit or miss, I guess. The source says they found 7 out of the 9 Holzbach immigrant sons papers, which sounds pretty good.
It's actually amazing they found that many.
Yeah.
Records get lost, destroyed. But yeah, 7 out of 9 is great.
But why were the women less likely to have their own papers?
Two main things, really, and they both speak volumes about the time. First, for a lot of immigrant women, their job was listed as homemaker. Citizenship just wasn't seen as necessary for their role or for getting ahead, not like it was for men seeking certain jobs or licenses.
Right. Different expectations.
And second, this is crucial. A woman automatically became a citizen if she married a man who was already naturalized, or even if she married an American-born citizen.
Oh, wow. So she got citizenship through her husband.
Exactly. So there was simply much less practical need for women to go through the whole application process themselves.
That makes sense, historically speaking. Okay. Rather than go through all 12 children one by one, let's maybe highlight a few whose stories really stand out. Tell us something about the immigrant experience, like Jacob, born 1834, the first one over, only 15 years old in 1849. That just seems incredibly young to make that journey alone.
It really is remarkable, Jacob, yeah. He lands in Massillon, probably drawn there by the big German-speaking community around St. Mary's Church. His mom's brothers, his uncles, were already there. He starts out as a blacksmith's apprentice. Then, interestingly, he actually enlists in the U.S. Army for about 6 years before the Civil War.
6 years in the Army, pre-war.
Yeah. And his final citizenship papers, he got them the day after he married Caroline Martin, who was an immigrant from Alsace. Talk about timing. Shows how quickly he was trying to establish himself.
And Jacob really did establish himself, didn't he? The source mentions breweries, hotels.
Oh, yeah. He got into the brewery business with his brother Adam for a while, then hotels. And eventually, he set up this very successful wholesale liquor business over in Niles, Ohio, became a really prominent guy in Niles. Director of the First National Bank, owned the Holzbach Bottling Works Company. A real success story.
Definitely embodies that potential.
For sure. His obituary was unusually long and detailed, which tells you something about his standing in the community.
Any downsides?
Well, sadly, his wife Caroline died quite young, complications from pregnancy. And Jacob never remarried after that.
Ah, that's tough. Now, your own great-grandfather, Adam E. Holzbach, was Jacob's younger brother, also a brewer.
That's right. Adam married Caroline's sister right there in Massillon, not long after Jacob and Caroline got married. A double wedding for the Martin sisters and Holzbach brothers, basically.
Ah, keeping it in the family.
Seems like it. Adam and Catherine moved around a bit more at first. Greenville, back to Massillon, Hubbard, then Niles and Warren. Often working with Jacob in the brewery trade. We don't have his naturalization papers, and his obituary wasn't very detailed, so pinning down his exact arrival date is harder. But the estimate is sometime in the late 1850s, following Jacob's path.
Okay. Then there's Nicholas, born 1839. His story is quite different, very poignant.
Yeah, Nicholas. Very little is actually known about him, except the tragic part. He died in the Civil War.
And the speculation is he might have enlisted for the bounty money?
That's the thinking, yeah. It was common. Foreign-born soldiers made up almost a quarter of the Union Army, and the enlistment bounties were a big draw for guys without many resources. His story is just. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of that war and how many immigrant families had loved ones go missing.
No official records found for him.
None. Which suggests the family probably just knew he enlisted and then never came back. They eventually put up a grave marker for him, a memorial, but his fate was likely unknown for a long time. It really speaks to those hidden sacrifices.
Absolutely. Then there's Michael, born 1840, a coal miner.
Yep. Michael spent most of his life as a coal miner down in Stark County. His family's story later branches out, connecting to Canton and even up towards Detroit through his kids.
And his gravesite discovery was pure luck.
Total chance. It was 1983. A descendant was taking a genealogy class, mentioned the name to a parish priest in Canton, and the priest just happened to know where the grave was. Pure serendipity.
Wow.
But that discovery provided crucial leads, names, dates. It just shows how sometimes you get these breakthroughs from unexpected places or just sheer luck. You need those little clues.
That brings us to a really important point Dr. Holzbach makes about the records themselves. He notes that 19th century American church records often aren't as good as the older European ones. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a key observation. And it raises questions about how records were kept differently. Think about it. European churches, often centuries old, built of stone or brick, usually well funded by tithes. They had a long tradition of really careful record keeping.
Right, built to last.
Exactly. Now, American churches, especially early ones out on the frontier or in growing towns, often built of wood, much more vulnerable to fire.
Ah, fire. Of course.
And the source lists examples. Saints Philip and James in Canal Fulton, St. Stephen's in Niles, where some Holzbachs went, even St. Mary's in Massillon, the main German church, all had major fires that destroyed records from before the 1890s.
So decades of history just gone up in smoke.
Pretty much. And it wasn't just fire.
What else?
Poor protection from water damage, parish staff getting cut back over the years so people are overworked and don't have time for archive requests. And sometimes newer staff just can't read the old handwriting, especially if it's in Latin. It all adds up. American church records could be much harder to work with than their European counterparts.
So it's not that people weren't trying, it's just the fragility of the records themselves makes the research even more impressive.
Definitely. That genealogical brick wall isn't always about hitting the end of the line. Sometimes it's just that the records themselves didn't survive. It takes persistence and, like we saw with Michael's grave, sometimes a bit of luck.
Okay, so given those challenges with church records, what did turn out to be the best sources for Dr. Holzbach's research here in America?
Civil records were huge. Things like birth, death, marriage certificates. He found a lot at places like the Stark County District Library in Canton and the Ohio Historical Society's Archives Library.
Government records, basically.
Right. And also, don't underestimate personal family records. Information passed down, and especially stuff found in old family Bibles. Those can be absolute gold mines.
Ah, the family Bible notes in the margin.
Exactly those. Sometimes they fill in gaps nothing else can.
Let's talk about where these immigrants settled. The source mentions separate German and Irish Catholic parishes, even in the same town. How did that work for the Holzbach?
You saw that clearly in places like Canton, Ohio. St. John the Baptist was the Irish parish. St. Peter was the German one. Both are historic landmarks now.
Separate churches for separate groups.
Yeah, and the German churches usually had German-born priests who spoke German. That obviously made new immigrants feel more at home, helped preserve their language and culture for a while. In Massillon, St. Mary's was the established German church. St. Joseph's came later, more for the Irish and English-speaking Catholics.
But people mixed sometimes, right? Like Peter Holzbach going to St. Joseph's?
Absolutely. Life isn't always neat boxes. His wife, Maria Witt, already had ties to St. Joseph's, so family connections could definitely override the ethnic parish lines. But in smaller towns like Niles or Hubbard, the Catholic communities just weren't big enough for separate churches. So a place like St. Stephen's in Niles had to serve both German and Irish immigrants.
A shared space.
Right. And this whole phenomenon of distinct national parishes, it mostly faded by the 1890s anyway, because then you had new waves of Catholic immigrants coming in, Italians, Poles, Slovaks, and they started setting up their own parishes. Shows how these communities constantly evolve.
It's also important to remember, as the source points out, that while the Holzbachs were Roman Catholic, maybe half of all German immigrants were actually Lutheran or other Protestant groups.
That's a crucial piece of context.
Yes.
It reminds us not to paint old German immigrants with the same brush. In fact, Dr. Holzbach even found a record of a Johann Philipp Holzbach in the Lutheran Church book in Meisenheim from the late 1780s. Same area, possibly related, different church.
So diversity, even within the same region back in Germany, just adds another layer.
Exactly. Identity is rarely simple.
Okay, let's bring it back to how this whole incredible family history got pieced together, especially bridging the gap between Germany and America. There's mention of the Witherspoon letter, described as a Rosetta Stone. What was that?
Ugh, the Witherspoon letter. It sounds dramatic, but Rosetta Stone is probably accurate here. It was absolutely critical. It was basically a typed document put together by a descendant named Zita Witherspoon Brewer.
Okay.
Zita recorded the memories of her mother, Sarah Ann Holzbach Witherspoon. And Sarah Ann was the daughter of Jacob Holzbach, the first of the main immigrant group we discussed.
So it's information passed down directly from one of the original immigrants.
Exactly. Verbal history captured on paper. It contained priceless details that Jacob himself remembered about places, dates, family names back in Germany, things you wouldn't find easily in official records. It specifically connected the known American family members back to their roots in Meisenheim and Schruckhoff.
Wow. Without that.
Dr. Holzbach himself says it. Without that letter, especially for nailing down that crucial pre-emigration information, this whole massive project, this deep dive we've been talking about, it just wouldn't have been possible.
Incredible. A single letter unlocking generations.
It really highlights the power of oral history
Yeah.
and those personal records we mentioned earlier. Sometimes that's the key that fits the lock. Truly a piece of amazing detective work, building on that foundation.
So, wrapping this all up, thinking about the Holzbach family's whole journey, what does it all mean for us, for you listening? What's the big takeaway?
Well, I think it shows that pretty much every family has a story like this, maybe buried somewhere. A story full of details that reflect bigger historical events. The Holzbach's journey really lights up the impact of things like economic hardship, political changes, and just that immense, often incredibly difficult immigrant experience on real people's lives.
Yeah.
It also shows the sheer dedication, the persistence, and sometimes, yeah, the pure luck involved in digging up and saving these personal histories.
It really makes you appreciate the effort behind something like this document.
Absolutely. This whole deep dive, it underlines the value of careful research and how sometimes crucial information can just pop up maybe decades later, connecting the dots. It's a powerful reminder, I think, that history isn't just about presidents and wars. It's made up of countless individual choices, struggles, migrations, like the Holzbachs, that all together weave the fabric of our world.
A great way to put it. And maybe as you think about your own family's history, the threads connecting you across time and place, just consider this. What Rosetta Stone might be hiding in your own family's past? What little story, what old letter, what half-remembered name could unlock a much bigger picture, revealing connections you never even imagined were there? Something to think about.